Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Our webinar today is about the functioning of the HAS system, and we'll talk more in particular about the interactions with the HAS consultants that will share some best practices with all of you. You are many to join us today, so please be aware that you're all muted. My name is Els, by the way. I'm moderating the webinar in the background together with my colleagues. We're a few here in this room today to make sure that all your questions are hopefully replied. Should your question remain unreplied today, please be aware that we, as usual, intend to make a Q&A report available that will be shared with you as soon as possible. As you're muted, we invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A panel, as you can see it on the slide. So please bear with us. If not all questions are replied, we make it happen later. Should you be on Twitter, please feel free to talk about the topic. We usually use the hashtag training for standards, and CEN and CENELEC are available via the handle @standards4EU. So without further ado, let's go to the speaker slide. We have a few of them today. I have the pleasure to have my colleagues Mauro and Frédéric in the room today. We will not be sharing our webcam because it's technically a bit annoying to do so. So you will not see them, but here are the pictures. From the Commission, we have the pleasure to have Federico Musso with us from DG Grow. And we have a few persons from Ernst Young that are on the next slide. So thank you for being with us, Dan, Emma, and Paco. So let's go straight away into the agenda, but we have a packed agenda today. The Commission, Federico will give us an introduction, of course. Next, my colleagues Mauro and Frédéric will be recapping on the harmonized standards development process. And then we have some updates from Ernst Young. We will try to reply as many questions as possible during the presentations, but hopefully we still have some time at the end to answer questions. So, Federico, I hope you're still with us. Please, the floor is yours.
I am. Thank you. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Good morning and welcome, everybody. I will try to give a very, very quick introduction. Most of the points will then later be addressed more in detail by the following speakers. But let's to set the scene, a few words about the new HAS system. The new, in the meantime, not even so new because the new system restarted in 2022. But there are some differences from the previous contract. So I would like to introduce you to these differences. Please, next slide. Okay, here is a very quick summary. This slide provides a sort of overview of the main new elements. We have tried, of course, to give a high degree of continuity, but we saw room for improvement, and we tried to address these gaps. So first of all, the budget. It was clear at the end of the previous contract that the budget allocated was not enough for all the requests, all the work to be carried out. So we increased it quite significantly from 2,200 working days. Let's not forget the HAS consultants are paid by working days or half working days per year, from 2,200 in the previous contract to 3,400 annually. So it's 55% increase in the budget allocated to the work of the HAS consultant. We also took note of the one lesson that we learned from the previous system. We have now pre-allocated really the resources by sectors, trying to anticipate the needs of each sector in a proportionate manner. We have increased also the possibility for consultants to take so-called communications tasks, which is mostly or almost exclusively meeting participation. It is a percentage of the overall payable amount of working time they can use. We increased the percentage from 20 to 25, so up to 1/4 of the working time can be dedicated to communication, to meetings participation. The rest must be dedicated to assessment of draft standards or final standards. We have introduced, and I think this was a request that a strong request from the ISOs, the possibility to have a so-called feedback mechanism, as it was called, by CEN and CENELEC when they requested it, basically to have a sort of additional assessment possibility in case at the very end of the development process or at the formal vote stage, the assessment was by the consultant was negative. So this will give the possibility to the TCs to draft the standards in the points that were flagged before actually launching the formal vote, and resubmit it for a final verification to the HAS consultant. This is a right that all TCs have in case of negative assessment. We have introduced a new task for the contractor, and today's webinar is actually one example of such a new task. So there was a request by the ISOs and the TCs to understand better, to have better communication, to have more information about how the system is designed, why it is designed like that, how it works, how the TCs can best make use of the system. And so indeed, there is a new task with allocated resources for communication, information, training campaign. Today's webinar, organized together with SMC, is an example of this new task. And finally, we have introduced a new possible outcome of the assessment, so-called conditional compliance, which, however, can be used only in very, very specific cases that I will highlight later. But following slide, please. Yeah, I think this is important. This contract has been signed after a public procurement tender procedure, meaning that the technical specification in the call for tender are really important. They are really binding. They provide a good description, a very detailed description of the system, and clarification on the tasks and how they should carry it out. And this is binding. So it's really, if somebody has a doubt or wants to understand better how specific aspects or specific elements or specific tasks of the HAS consultant must be intended, what they are supposed to do or not, this technical specification, which is a publicly available document, the link is here in the slide, provide all this information. And I think as a reference document, it can be sometimes very useful. Overall, as I said, we try to keep a high degree of continuity with the previous system. The principles, the main principles are the same. The overall structure is the same. We only try to introduce a number of improvements based on the feedback received during the execution of the first contract. Next slide, please. So increase of resources, I already mentioned these. What I also mentioned is that there is a pre-allocation by sector. If you want to know which sector received how much, in the technical specification mentioned in my previous slides, there is a table where you see how many working days have been allocated per year to each sector. Is this carved in stone? Yes and no, in the sense that, of course, it's in the technical specification. So this is the starting, situation. However, every year after, having observed the evolution of the work, the evolution of the quotas, if we see that a sector has received more resources than actually needed, and another sector maybe less than actually needed, we can redistribute the resources by sector. So it is possible, of course, on a yearly basis to evaluate and assess if the allocation is still appropriate, if it meets the needs, if it's necessary to reshuffle something. Next slide, please. Yes, the feedback mechanism, as I said, many of you might know that in the past, after it's one assessment per stage. This is the principle. So committee draft, inquiry, formal vote. It's very annoying if at formal vote there is a negative assessment. In the past contract, there was a possibility to have so-called PUB stage assessment, which was considered to be exceptional, or in any case, it had to be duly justified. Now, thanks also to the increase of resources that we have now under the new contract, we were able to provide an additional assessment stage, which is it kicks in. It's a right that all have, so there is no justification needed. In case of negative assessment at formal vote stage, if the TC wishes to make some changes to the standards and request a new assessment of the revised version of the standard, it can request this. We called it last confirmatory assessment, LCA. It's really a right to have. The only condition is that there was a negative assessment at formal vote stage. And of course, what we also kept and make basically more systematic is that the possibility for the desk officers in the commission to ask for a final verification of the standards that have been adopted by the ISOs and that have been submitted formally for citation in the official journal. Next slide, please. As I said, there is a new possible outcome in the assessment. We had, as you know, and it was binary, the choice so far, either negative or positive, either compliant or non-compliant. However, for one specific case, this binary choice was a little bit problematic because you have standards being developed in parallel. Typically, it's usually standard series meant to be developed and adopted at the same time, and then later submitted together to the Commission for Citation. And normally these standards contain a lot of cross-references to each other. Now, as you know, in principle, normative references to draft standards are not acceptable, but in this case, it was unavoidable. And this was triggering, in some cases, negative assessment. This was the only finding, which was very annoying and understandably so. So in this specific case, indeed, the consultant can choose if this is the only critical finding that he or she has spotted in the draft standard to give a conditional compliance. So said, conditional to what? That at the moment of finalization and adoption of the standards, the normative references will be then changed to final version of the other standard. So this should avoid useless frustrations and also facilitate the progress of the work. So next slide. I think I'm almost finished. Well, new task for the contractor. Today's webinar, indeed. We have a dedicated amount of, working days dedicated to, to this task. That is a task not on the HAS consultant, but on EY, so the contractor that has been selected to manage the pool of consultants. I think, given also the wide attendance, I see already more than 300 participants. This shows that this was really a task that was necessary, that has an added value, that is perceived as positive, and by the stakeholders, by the experts, and so I'm really happy. And there will be more of these events during the full service contract. And in the future, also this will also involve provision of quantitative, qualitative analysis, so providing data that is really sometimes necessary to understand how the system is functioning, where the issues are. And I think there is still one slide. Yeah, well, this is a conclusion indeed. As I said, we try to improve the system, but the principle remain the same. So basically, the HAS consultant assess harmonized standards. HAS stands for harmonized standard consultant. The other cases, for instance, transport sector, in energy sector, where there are standards requested by the Commission, by the Union to support legislation, which, however, are not harmonized standards. So these are outside the scope of this service contract. They work mainly for the Commission. So basically they have to support us in ensuring that we comply with our legal obligation under Article 10.5 and 10.6 of the standardization regulation, meaning basically that we have to assess, evaluate the compliance of the draft standards and of the final standards proposed for citation with the legislation and with the related standardization request. As before, the consultants are there to assess, to evaluate, not to co-draft the standards, not to negotiate possible consensual solution within the TCs. This is an exclusive territory of the ISOs, of the experts, of the TCs. We should not interfere, not the Commission, not the consultants, with these internal processes. And yeah, and basically they are there to assess, but not really to steer or to complement the expertise of technical committees. So possibly this was my last slide. Just check if there is, yeah, indeed. So I will try to reply to the questions in the question and answer chat, and anyway, and afterwards you can always contact me in case of doubts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico, for this nice overview. Indeed, a few questions came in when you were talking, so please have a look and possibly answer them right away. So I would like to continue now with the next slides and introduce my colleague, Frédéric, who's sitting next to me. So please, Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this joint webinar today. So the development of a harmonized standard starts by the creation of a new work item. On the screen, you can see here on the left the new work item template for CEN, and on the right the new work item template for CENELEC. When creating a new work item, technical bodies should check in the new work item form the relevant standardization request mandate to be addressed by the reference. For parallel projects work under Frankfurt Agreement, the reference will be created by CCMC in the technical body work program. Nevertheless, technical bodies should check if the links to legislations are not missing and or are correct. During its development, a candidate harmonized standard can be assessed maximum four times. There's one assessment per stage, plus the confirmatory assessment, as Federico just said, that is called the last confirmatory assessment is needed. If needed. Mauro, my colleague, will come back more in detail we'll talk about the last confirmatory assessment, but I can already say that, as Federico said, it's only possible to use a last confirmatory assessment if the project received a lack of compliant assessment at formal vote. The first working draft assessment is optional, but it is highly recommended. Identifying potential issues early in the development process will help address them before the end of the development, and thus increase the chances of getting a compliant assessment at the end. As well, be aware that it's not possible to request an assessment on a published standard. Let's now see practically how to request a first working draft assessment. As said before, it is highly recommended to go for a first working draft assessment. Technical body should submit the first working draft to CCMC through the submission interface. Then the CCMC technical PM will submit the assessment request, the assessment package to EY for the assessment, and a first draft of the Annex Z should be provided, and as well the CD text for parallel work for international work. Then, when the assessment report is made available, the technical body secretary will be notified by email. And in case of lack of compliant assessments, it's possible as well to request a meeting with the HAS consultant to discuss the comments, and our colleagues from EY will present later the meeting request tool. Let's see now how the submission interface looks like. So when you use the submission interface to request the first working draft assessment, make sure to check the links to the directives to make sure that they are correct. A comment saying HAS assessment required has to be inserted in the field called comments to CCMC. You can see it on the bottom left of the screen. And so this is how the first working draft assessment needs to be requested. I will now leave the floor to my colleague Mauro, who will talk about the development process of our harmonized standard.
Thank you, Frederick. Good morning, everyone. So coming back to the development process, as Frederick mentioned before, there are 4 stages to make the assessment or to request the assessment. On this template, we can see 3 of them, and I will explain afterwards. The first stage of assessments is the first working draft, which CCMC highly recommends because it improves the chances of compliance assessment in the next stages. The second stage of assessment is before inquiry vote. If in this case, if the assessment is compliant, and if the vote on inquiry is positive, there is a possibility to offer the reference for publication in official journal directly without going through the formal vote. The third stage of assessment is before formal vote. At this stage, if the assessment is lack of compliance, there is the 4th possibility of assessment, that is the lack of compliance. Next slide, please. So the last conformity assessment. This last stage is done, as I told, if in the formal vote assessment there is a lack of compliance outcome. Normally, this stage should be done before the formal vote, due to the possibility to the TC address all the comments from the consultants. This normally is possible when there is a reference from homegrown or parallel work with ISO, because normally it is possible to delay the process due to the sun lead on the project. In case there is no possibility of doing the last conformity assessment before formal vote, there is still the possibility to do it afterwards. But at this case, not all the comments from the ask contractor consultant can be addressed, as the formal vote was already launched and voted. Yeah. The outcomes from the ask consultant assessments normally are of three types. The compliant one, in this case, the reference of the draft complies with all requirements from the ask consultant and the European Commission. And in this case, if the European Commission sees that as the same conclusion as the ask consultant, the reference will be published on the official journal. In the other way around, there is the lack of compliance outcome. That it means that the reference or the draft had not fulfilled all the requirements from the ask contractor, and in this case, if the European Commission has the same conclusion as the ask contractor or the ask consultant, the reference will not be published in official journal. The third one that it was introduced now is the condition compliance. At this case, normally the reference comply with all the requirements, except with some issues of normative references that are interlinked with other references that are under drafting. At this case, if these issues will be addressed afterwards, the reference can still be available to be published in the official journal. The template of the report of the assessment can be accessed at CEN and CENELEC post pages. The outcome or the conclusion of the assessment can be found at Part A, summary of the assessment, as it is shown on the slide. Normally, the duration of the assessment is 5 weeks after the request to be assessed of the reference. However, because of the backlog now, this time frame is longer than usual.
Thank you, Mauro. I will now do a short recap related to the checklist of harmonized standards. So in the previous slide, you saw a template for the HAS assessment report. This template is about to be changed. I will talk about it in the next slide. So as a reminder, for the checklist for a harmonized standard, it was developed to help technical bodies identify critical elements in the body of the text or in the European annexes that could potentially lead to a lack of compliance assessments. The checklist covers horizontal topics. It was made mandatory as of end of 2021 and shall be delivered together with the draft and annexes for any assessment requests are at any stages. The checklist for harmonized standard is mandatory for homegrown harmonized standard, and it is strongly recommended for projects under Frankfurt Agreement. So this is how the actual checklist for harmonized standards looks like. Now, to make sure that everybody talks the same language, a new checklist has been developed. This new common checklist has been developed together with the European Commission and the ESOs. The goal being to have the same checklist used by the ESOs, so CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI, the HAS consultant, and the European Commission. The common checklist is divided in 3 parts. The part 1 includes criteria for ESOs only. The part B3 includes common criteria for European Commission as consultants and ESOs, and the part C is dedicated to administrative requirements for the as consultants. So that's where the outcome of the assessment report will be written. This checklist is actually under final stage of approval and will replace the checklist for harmonized standard in the coming month. There will be specific communication and training about this new common checklist that will follow in the coming weeks. This is how the new common checklist looks like. So you can see the part 1.1 at the beginning that is common to the ESOs, and then the part B3 that is common to the European Commission, the as consultant, and the ESOs. I will now give the floor to Mauro for the last updates.
Thank you, Frederick, again. CCMC predicts that in July, some new elements will be found in the projects online regarding legislation and citation. These new elements will be found under the tab EC after relations. CCMC predicts as well that by the end of the fourth quarter of 2023, the AS assessment report will be available in projects online for download as well. Next slide. Now there is a new AS assessment platform tool. It's a consultant assessment interface where CCMC can request the assessment of drafts of harmonized standards. As well, in this as platform tool, UI can upload the AS assessment reports, and in the case of any AS assessment report of a TC or related to a TC is uploaded in the system, the technical body secretary will get a notification via email.
Thank you very much, Frederic and Mauro, for this interesting overview. We had a suggestion of someone saying that there are many abbreviations on the slide, so I suggest that we create a little list with the explanations, and we will share that with you anyway. So let's continue now with the best practices and information that the Ernst Young HAS consultants have to share with us. So please, I don't know who's taking the floor first, but please go ahead.
It will be me. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan. I'm the project manager at the EY side of the HAS project. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's great to see that many of you are attending. And of course, also thank you to CCMC for providing this opportunity to directly engage with you. Of course, many or most of you will know the HAS system and will have meetings with HAS consultants in the past, but the contact between our team, the HAS support team, managing the HAS contract for the European Commission, and you, the technical committees, has been more limited so far. And as already mentioned by Federico earlier, in the current contract, we would like to address that. There's a separate task for that, and the current meeting is a part of that. So great to be able to speak to you today. We know that the HAS system is important to you and affects your daily work in the technical committees. And we're happy to, with this possibility, to give some more details about its working and to be able to answer some of the questions directly. So on to the next slide. What do we on Ernst Young's EY's side have on the agenda today? So I will start with a brief introduction on the HAS project background, but that's already largely covered by the other presentations, so I will keep that really brief. Then we will give a brief update on where we are with the assessment work since the beginning of the contract of the current contract in 2022. Subsequently, we will provide some best practices for technical committees under the HAS system, and then we will focus on a specific element which causes frequently some issues. So that's the normative references in harmonized standards. So on the HAS project background, so this was already mentioned by Federico. So it's just a very high level overview. So the current HAS system aims to contribute to the clarity, quality, and consistency and coherence of harmonized standards adapted by the European standardization organizations in reply to Commission mandates. In the execution of Article 10 of the 2012 Regulation on European Standardization, this Article 10 defines, among others, that the Commission may request the ESOs to develop a European standard for European standardization deliverable, and that the Commission, together with the ESO, shall assess the compliance of documents drafted by the ESOs with the initial request. So that's the mandate of the HAS system. So what does that mean in practice? That's on the next slide. So what we would really like to underline is that, I mean, we carry out this project for the European Commission, who have commissioned us to do this work. We contracted it to us, but it's also, of course, not only a service to the Commission, but it's also a service to the technical bodies. So it's a service to you, with the aim to increase the compliance of harmonized standards, and in this way increase the publication rate of European standards in the official journal. And I think it's also worth highlighting that in the previous contract that was indeed achieved. So the publication rate went up, and with that something we will build upon under the current contract. So the main objectives of the HAS system, ensure that typical compliance concerns are identified to reduce the number of non-compliant draft standards, provide targeted training to HAS consultants. That's something we do on a regular basis. ESO, so that's something the current meeting is part of, and what we will do more under the current contract, so reach out to the ESOs directly. And of course, we are also in frequent contact with the Commission services. So key aim is here to support the Commission in its efforts to reduce the number of non-cited harmonized standards. And that's our key task of our internal task of our team, if you can call it that way, is to ensure that the consultants that we contract, so the HAS consultants, are able to do their work effectively and efficiently, and can focus on their core task, which is the producing assessment reports. So next, on the next slide, you can move to the next one. Yes, so next we would like to give you a brief update on where we are in the current HAS contract. So the contract was signed over the summer last year. But there was some startup time required that had to do with the fact that we needed to recontract the HAS consultants. So most of the HAS consultants that currently work for us also worked under the last contract, but they had to be recontracted. A couple had to be, for a couple of positions, we had to recruit new consultants. We trained them, provide additional training. And then we had to adapt to some technical change in the platform for downloading normative references, notably. So since the start of the actual assessment work, which started in October last year, and the first ones were completed in November. So since the start of last year, we have received about 800 requests from the ESOs, of which about half have been completed so far. So we are at 44 you see here in the slide currently. I looked at it yesterday, so the data you see here is from a bit earlier, it's from the 5th of May. Yesterday, about 45% were completed. So completed means here that they have been uploaded to CCMC system and sent back to the Commission. So these are fully completed requests, fully completed assessment reports that have been sent back to the requesters. So the remainder are either in the pipeline, are ongoing with the HAS consultants, or on the quality review. So I can explain a bit what that means. So pipeline means that they have not yet been designated to a consultant. This is usually a very brief stage, apart from a couple of sectors where we have a backlog. Ongoing with HAS consultants means that it has been shared with HAS consultants, and they have accepted the work order, so they are actually have it in their planning or are already working on it. And the quality review means that it's with our HAS quality review team, which is led by Paco, who will speak later on. So they do an internal quality check on the completed reports completed by the consultants to see if all rules have been followed. So it's a horizontal check to see if all boxes have been ticked and if it has been carried out in the right way. Before we share it again with the TCs and the commission. So as you can see on the left-hand side, by far most requests are coming from 3 sectors. So these are machinery, low voltage, and the rail systems technical committee. So these are the ones requesting by far the most, almost half. These are also the sectors where you see most delays. So more than 90% of the ones that are currently in the pipeline, so which have not yet been allocated to a consultant. And also actually a lot of the ones that are actually ongoing with HAS consultants are from these 3 sectors. So what explains this? Among others that, I mean, we can already assign them to them, but a couple of consultants have been booked for 4 weeks in advance. So they're assigning them more work won't actually speed up the work. A bottleneck is here also that while we have also most consultants for these sectors, it can be, and it has been the case over the last couple of months, that so a lot of requests are coming from specific technical committees, which means that they need to be allocated to specific consultants, because we have, for the larger sectors, we have consultants covering specific TCs. So some additional recruitment has been done over the last couple of months, which has increased notably in machinery the capacity, and that you can also see in the next slide. Please move. Yeah, so here you see the number of requests received versus the number of reports provided to the ESOs per month since the beginning of the current contract. And of course, where we want to are is that we do substantially more than we receive. And this was not the case in the first couple of months. You see a huge number of requests in August. These are all the requests that had been, well, we didn't receive them, but they were submitted when the contract was not live. So as you all know, the HAS contract there's been a gap of a couple of months between the end of the last contract and the start of the current contract. But assessment work or drafting work on your side, of course, included. So we received a very large number of requests in the summer last year, and then the number of requests stayed high also at the end of last year, but now since has declined and is now more at an, let's say, the average number that we also saw in the last contract. And you can see the effect of hiring more consultants, because since March we are doing substantially more, completing substantially more requests than we get in. That's the situation where we need to be. So we achieved that also in April. April, of course, also some holidays, so the number was a bit lower, but we are still about at the same level in March and May here. So here you see data until the 5th of May. So that was you only see the beginning of the month where we didn't receive any requests yet. I checked yesterday evening as well. So we are really at substantially more complete. And again, also in May, in all likelihood, we will do complete substantially more assessments than we get in. I think worth mentioning here is also that at the level we are at since March, March is among the best months since the starting of the current HAS system in 2018 in terms of number of complete. So it's certainly not the case that we are now processing less requests than before, or completing less requests than before. We are at the same level, I think actually somewhat above it. I think we can indeed increase it a little bit more, but we are on track to do that. So we recognize that it will take some time still to reduce the backlog in all sectors. I think in most sectors it has already to a large extent been solved, but in some of the ones that I mentioned earlier, there's not yet the case, but we are on track and should be able to substantially reduce the delays in the next couple of months. So on the outcome of the assessment report, so what you see here are what the outcome given by the HAS consultants to in their assessment report, so how they judge the draft standards they assess. And you can see that the average compliance rate, or the the proportion of reports with a compliant outcome is low. It's 19% overall. There is variation across sectors. Of course, here it's important to take into account that in some sectors the number of requests is much higher than in others. So it should be interpreted with care. If there's a very low number of requests, of course, this can have a large influence on the outcomes here. So what are the main reasons for non-compliance? There's not a single one that stands out. So there are a couple of ones. It's a range of ones that we see returning frequently. This is technical content of the document contains requirements that do not align or contradict relevant EU legislation. The Annex Z does not properly refer to relevant legal requirements. Normative references need updating or reconsideration. And because the latter one is also included here, and because we get a lot of questions about the normative references, that was also a reason for including it in today's presentation and paying somewhat more attention to it. So that's it on my side. We will go on with some more operational information provided by Emma of the HAS support.
Thank you very much, Dan, and good morning, everyone. So indeed, I will be focusing a bit more on the best practices for TCs in order to interact with the HAS consultants, what to expect when requesting an assessment, and when can you request an assessment. So if we can move to the next slide. And as Frédéric already mentioned, there are 4 stages where you are allowed to request an assessment. Inquiry and formal vote are mandatory, but of course, you're fully encouraged to also request it already at committee draft. As Federico mentioned, after the formal vote, assessment is performed by the HAS consultants. If it is a negative assessment, you are allowed to request a new assessment, which is called the last confirmatory assessment, and that will be done before publication and after the formal vote. So what can you expect when you request those assessments? Well, it's important to remember what the role of the HAS consultants is. So the consultants will not be helping you in the drafting of the standard per se. They will only be doing technical verifications of the standard, whether it is compliant or not. So as Dan already mentioned, they work to support the Commission, but they are not the ones actually deciding whether the standard should or shouldn't be published. And this is an important point. This decision is and will remain within the hands of the European Commission. And so the outcome of a standard, whether it's compliant, doesn't guarantee necessarily that it will be published. That is a decision made by the Commission. So if we move to the next slide, what do the consultants do when they perform an assessment? Well, as I said, they do the technical verification. So they will ensure that first the standard qualifies as a harmonized standard, meaning that it's drafted in response to a standardization request. They will verify which are the legal requirements aimed to be covered, whether the standard sufficiently satisfies with those requirements. And then they will also verify that the scope of the standard doesn't go beyond the standardization request, and that any non-harmonized content is not inappropriately associated with those requirements. So this is actually a procedure that is divided in 3 steps that we can look into the next slide. And the TCs are strongly encouraged to also keep this checklist from the Commission in mind when you are drafting standards and when you are also submitting a request, because this will help you increase the rate of compliance of the standards you are drafting. So the very first step is quite formal. As I said, ensuring that the standard is developed in response to a standardization request, that there is no formal objection, that they do have the required Annex Z or its equivalent that they need to actually perform the assessment, and also that they have access to all the normative references required. Then the second step will be more focused on the legal requirements to be covered, whether they are clear and transparent as to the normative parts supporting legal requirements, and that the standard does not contain any elements outside of the scope of the request. And then with regards to the assessment of the legal requirements aim to be covered, the consultant will ensure that they sufficiently satisfy the requirements of the request, and that again, no non-harmonized content is supporting legal requirements in a way that it shouldn't. And these are elements that the TCs are strongly encouraged to keep in mind when you are drafting a standard, because this is also both what the consultants and the Commission will be looking into when making a decision whether the standard is compliant or whether it should be cited or not. So if we move to the next slide on this point, before you submit a request, you are strongly encouraged to have a look at those checklists. Ensure also that you provide all of the elements that are required for the HAS consultant, so the annexes, the European elements, so European forward and everything that are needed for a standard to be assessed by a HAS consultant. Please also make sure that you send us the most recent version of the standard. This is very important because it doesn't make sense for us to use resources to assess an old standard or an old document that has been modified in the meantime. Ideally, if there has been a previous assessment before, we recommend that you also submit a track changes version of the standard, because that will facilitate the work of the consultants, and also that you provide the response to the previous comments made by the HAS consultants. So this is, of course, if there has been a previous assessment made. So you are very strongly encouraged to perform this self-verification before you submit a standard, because this is really a best practice that will allow you to increase compliance rate. As we have seen with Dan, the overall compliance rate is quite low, and this is one of the actions that we are aiming to have so that we can really increase this and increase also the citation ideally at the very end. So this covers the best practices for requesting assessments. We can now move to the best practices for requesting meetings. So as you all know, the assessment reports are now anonymous. And this is a very important point, because this increases actually the work that EY has to do when you submit a request. So we ask you to, when possible, submit that request 4 weeks before the meeting day. That will allow us to get in contact with the consultant, secure the availability of the consultant, and give us some time to revert back to you also to confirm everything. I know there has been some cases in the past. This should be decreasing now, but indeed we were initially focusing more on the assessment work. So not all meeting requests were accepted, but from now on, this should improve quite strongly. We also encourage you also to submit a full agenda of the meeting, because this will allow the consultant to be as best prepared as possible and make the meeting as efficient as possible. Because of course we have, even if we have some important resources, they are limited. And so making the best use of that is really something to keep in mind and in the best interest of everyone. Ideally, you should always and only request meetings that are linked to a previous assessment. If that is the case, you can already consider that it will be accepted. Anything that is beyond the scope of previous assessments needs to be discussed more and agreed with the Commission, and it's a bit more limited as to what the consultants are allowed to participate in terms of meetings or not. So you can find the tool to the meeting here. I will not be doing a live example because it's pretty straightforward. It's an online questionnaire where you have to provide your name, the TC, the item that you would like to discuss, the agenda of the meeting, the date and time, and so on. So it's fairly straightforward. However, please keep in mind that the HAS consultants, and as Federico mentioned, there is a strict limit as to what a HAS consultant can or cannot do. And this fine line that we are enforcing is one that has to be respected, in the sense that the consultants work to support the Commission, but they're not allowed to participate in the drafting of any standards. So they are not allowed to give you the exact wording that you should put in a standard. They are not allowed to verify any document that you would ask them to do so during the meeting. They can only act within the formal boundaries of our project, meaning that what they do needs to be approved by EY before they participate. So you can also not ask them, for example, to modify an assessment report because you have made the changes to the standard. This is a practice that is not acceptable, and that will never be acceptable also in the future. As Federico mentioned also earlier, the increase of resources means that we have actually increased the time that the consultants can spend in meeting. It used to be 20% of their total work. Now it represents 25% of their time. So this is a gesture that we want to encourage the contact with TCs, but of course the focus will remain also in the future, the assessment work per se. So this covers the best practices. I haven't seen in the chat if there are any questions. I will try to reply to them. And I would like to give the floor to Paco for some guidance and rules on normative references. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I see some very well-known names. My name is Francisco Verdera, but as you have heard before, mostly everybody calls me Paco, so I'm very glad to be called also Paco by you. And okay, let's go to the next slide, because normative references, as it was mentioned before, is one of the main important, or I would say fundamental causes for non-compliance. And this is really something that can be avoided very, very easily by the technical committees. Of course, we are providing a service to the European Commission, but we are also providing a service to the standardization community like you. So we would like to explain which are the situations we should avoid and why we are, let's say, so strict with normative references. In principle, normative references are, of course, normally references to other standards. They are cited in such a way that normally they constitute requirements of the document, or they also constitute, let's say, they provide testing methods or assessment methods regarding certain requirements. So normative references are really an important element here in the assessment. And let's go to the next slide, and possibly I can explain in a clear way, because in fact, what we are here talking is about legal certainty. And legal certainty, the technical committees are the first interested to have legal certainty on the standards that are cited in the official journal. I could give you many examples why the technical committees and the industry experts and other experts participating in technical committees really are interested in having legal certainty on the references that are provided in the standard. Imagine that a standard makes not clear which is the version of the standard that has to be applied for a particular requirement. This could mean that possibly industry could be using one version, and then one or two or three market surveillance authorities could be using another one, or a testing house could be using. So in reality, it is for the benefit of everybody that we understand precisely which is the version of the standard that is cited in the context of a harmonized standard. And that's why we accept dated normative references, references to European and international standards, and we will see also that there may be some additional elements that could be acceptable and why. And of course, the normative references that really for which the HAS consultant is focusing on is in those relevant sections and subsections of the harmonized standards. This means those sections or subsections that are supporting particular paragraphs or sections that are referred to in the annex, corresponding annex set of the, or annex A in the case of ETSI, of the harmonized standard. So the idea really behind, and the need here behind, is to ensure legal certainty and clarity, that everybody understands, all the users of the standards understands which are the versions of the standards that have to be followed. And here I would ask my CCNC colleagues to go to the next slide. Here we have several examples of dated or undated normative references. In this case, we have a zero tolerance for undated normative references, as I said before, and the reason is clarity and legal certainty. So where shall we have the, let's say, the reference to be cited or to be dated? Well, in the case of homegrown, and this means European standards that are fully developed by the ISOs, not using international documents as a reference for adoption. Dated, the standards shall be dated, the references shall be dated in the specific clauses or subclauses of the text and in the normative reference section. Of course, it may happen that, okay, a technical committee does not date a particular paragraph or a particular section, which is the example in the right, in the top right. Then, okay, if it's at least dated in the section normative references of the standard, then everybody understands which is the version that has to be applied. And therefore, then you have legal certainty and then you have clarity, which is what we are looking for. So in those cases, of course, the preferred is to cite everywhere, but at least, if this is not the case, at least they are dated in the normative references. But of course, we know that ISO standards, we cannot influence the way that ISO is citing or is dating their normative references. So normally we know that ISO is undating the references because they say normally is the latest version that you are applying. In this case, then CEN has developed a tool which is creating an annex with the dated reference versions that are applicable in this case. So in this case, for us, it's perfectly fine because then the user of the standard, whoever he is, it could be industry or I said before, even a testing house or a notified body or a market surveillance authority knows, because then in the annex is clearly indicated which is the version of the standard that has to be used. And the same applies for IC, but in the case of IC, it was easier because the Annex ZA is a long-standing practice in the CENELEC community. So in reality, we know that the Annex ZA contains the corresponding dated version. The devil is in the details, of course, and we will see now what I mean. So let's go to the next slide and maybe we can see normative references must be dated. And therefore, if they have a date, they shall be published. Here you have in the square on the right some examples of unacceptable normative references. I'm not going to go to read all of them, but you have them. I mean, the slides will be distributed and made available by CEN and CENELEC, so it's better to go to the highlights. And the highlights is the standards shall be dated, the references shall be dated, they shall be dated in the clauses or subclauses referred to in the Annex Z. If the undated reference is in somewhere else, not supporting the harmonized part of the standard, the HAS consultants should not really, I mean, they may see it, they may tell you, but it's not their role. Their main role is to detect those that are supporting the Annex ZA. Publish the standard means there is legal certainty and clarity also on the version that applies. This is not the case for draft standards, and let me tell you why. I mean, draft standards, there is no insurance that they will be continuously available over time. Sometimes they could be even continuously available in time after the publication in the official journal, but imagine that then there are different versions of a CD or there are different versions of a formal vote version. So then it's difficult for the user to keep track of the changes, and therefore the user would not be in a position to know which are the versions that have to be applied. Of course, it was mentioned by our colleagues in CEN and CENELEC, in CCMC, if blocks of draft standards are being developed in parallel, we have a figure that is conditional compliance. And I saw one of the questions in the chat regarding, for example, conditional compliance. What does it mean? Which is the implication if we have a conditional compliance? Well, in reality, there is no implication. The only implication is that if the standard has conditional compliance and all the block standards that have been developed in parallel are also published at the time that the standard is offered to the European Commission, then there is no problem, because at that time it had a conditional compliance, but then all the standards that were referred to, and they were part of the block, because sometimes we know in the case of explosives or pyro or some other cases, you have standards that are being developed in parallel. And in this case, if the standard is offered at the time that all the previous standards that were referred in the standard are also published, then there is no issue. Okay, so I hope I was able to explain clearly the situation. Okay, there are some cases, and let's go to the next slide. There are some possible cases of undated normative references that are not leading to a lack of compliance. Of course, those that are not supporting the part that is cited in the Annex Z, it's clear. But there are also other cases, consumables, screws, nuts, bolts, dimensions that do not change over time, that are clearly standardized and everybody's using them. Terminology standards, reference to databases. We know that sometimes we have a database for terminology or graphical symbols. Plugs and sockets outlet dimensions, in this case, the famous IEC standard dealing with plugs and sockets is a catalog standard. And in this case, normally, well, if there is a reference to plugs and sockets, and it's really not, we know, for example, in the case of low voltage, that the low voltage directive is not, the plugs and sockets are not part of the low voltage directive, because they are part of the national, sometimes national standards or national wiring rules and national installations. Then it's also, in this case, this could be accepted as long as it does not support a harmonized part supporting the Annex Z. Electrical installation standards also in sections not supporting the Annex Z, or undated references, as I said before, in clauses that are not supporting legal requirements. In those cases, the harmonized standard consultant should not really indicate, unless, well, it's not part of the role, because our role is to see the parts that are supporting the Annex Z. Let's go to the next slide. We also have examples here of allowed and non-allowed normative references. So allowed references, clearly a reference to a European standard, which means EN, EN-ISO or EN-IC. Standards, international standards in the sense of Regulation 1025, ISO, IC, ITU, normally is ITUR. In those cases, we or ISO, IC. These are standards that are developed according to international standardization bodies. But then we have a gray area that we call international benchmarks. Okay, and here these are examples. IMO, the Maritime Organization, ICAO, Civil Aviation specifications, CIE, the Comité de Iluminación International Declaration, so the Committee of Lighting, International Committee of Lighting, the UIC specifications, is the Association International of Rail Equipment, the ETSI partnerships such as the 3GPP or 1M2M, where European participation is clearly ensured. Some well-known consortium applying France principles, for example, Bluetooth. We are all using Bluetooth, and it's not an international standard, legally speaking, according to Regulation 1025, but it's a very clear and well-known consortium that applies FRAND. So this means fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory practices. So USBC, etc., etc. Let's go to the next slide. Not allowed normally having a reference to a national adoption of a European standard or reference to a national standard. Okay, this should be avoided. Also references to other national standards like ANSI, American National Standard Institute, Canadian standards, Australian, New Zealand standards, or other US SDOs that are, well, very well known as, and sometimes they are globally recognized, but they are not in stricto sense international standard organizations: ASTM, UL, ASME, SAE, ASRAE, or IEEE. In the case of IEEE, of course, it may depend on the practices for the different sectors. Per se, they are not international standards, but okay, it's a matter that, of course, in any case, a consultation should be made for the specific cases. But in general, if there is any possibility to avoid the reference to IEEE, well, I would strongly recommend that this is avoided. Let's go to the next slide. Some examples on how to make references that are acceptable. You see them on the left: EN XXX, EN ISO, EN 6. Now they are in CENELEC EN IC. Set, or references to CISPR and electromagnetic related standards 55. Okay, so this is perfectly acceptable, the same as the right examples: EN ASTM, EN ISO ISTM, because it's not an ASTM, it's an EN adopting an ASTM, or is an EN ISO ISTM, so it's an international standard that is adopted in Europe, that was adopting an original ASTM standard, and the same applies for EN IC IEEE standards. So they are really IC standards adopting IEEE, but they are IC standards, and they have been submitted to the international consensus. Let's go to the next slide. References to drafts. As I said before, they are not accepted in general. We also have the situation where we have packages of standards being developed in parallel, then we may apply the conditional compliance. But here the key is that we need to ensure the availability and traceability in time. And that's why references to drafts should be avoided. Let's go to the next slide. And then where to date normative references. Well, normally, as I said before, section normative references and or in clauses or subclauses referred to in the Annex Z. But if you do it in the section normative references or in the annexes provided by CEN or IEC, sorry, or CENELEC, then it should be okay. Next slide. Well, yes, there is also a note here, which is the state of the art. Normally, we should refer to the most recent standards. Of course, we should try to avoid references to outdated standards unless there is a good reason for doing that. For example, that the newest version has some issues or had let's say a formal objection, or there were some issues with the newest version. Okay, let's go to the next one. References. Yes, references in Annex Z. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Annex Z is not the place to introduce references that may have an implication on the legal effect of the standard, of the harmonized standard. There are other places in the standard where you can include references to standards. We know that some technical committees, they really introduce references in Annex Z because they want to be more clear and they want to give more information to the user of the standard. But please do not do it, because in reality this only complicates, and this has really complicated let's say the eligibility of the standard to be possibly cited later on by the European Commission. So if it's something that you can avoid, please avoid it, because the HAS consultant will identify this and this will create a problem. We know also that there are some exceptions or some particular cases, like for example, the EN 60335-part 1, which is the household appliances, or some other very well-known collections of standards by which the part 1 is modified by the corresponding part 2, part something. We know this, but if you can avoid, I mean, of course, in this case, we could have an exception because you cannot apply the part 2, part whatever, without applying the part 1. but try to avoid as much as possible, please, references in the Annex ZA, because this will, as I said, this will only complicate the citation. And what we want is to maximize the chances that your standards are eligible for citation in the official journal. Let's go to the next slide. And conclusion. Well, I think I have repeated it too many times, but please understand, normative references remain one of the main reasons for non-citation. And this is something that we really could avoid very easily. So please respect the applicable drafting rules of the ISOs that clarify very well that. So then the normative references shall respect the applicable drafting rules. They shall provide legal certainty and clarity for the user. So it has to be crystal clear which is the version that has to be applied. Shall be dated and published. Remember, we could accept during the time of drafting that there are packages of standards being developed in parallel, but this is only for cases where you have groups of standards being developed in parallel, and then the consultant could say, okay, conditional compliance, this means the standard is compliant, but of course, if all the draft standards that are going in parallel, they are published at the moment that the standard is offered to the European Commission. The normative references shall be fully compliant in case they support essential requirements, and they shall remain available over time for the user of the standard. So therefore, a user of a standard can always know which is the standard and can access it when using the standard. So this is what from my side. I hope we will check later the questions and answers in case there is an additional question on this topic, and I hope this was sufficiently clear for everybody, or that I was good enough in explaining these situations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paco. I think it was indeed very clear. Many questions came in while you were talking, but I have to thank all the colleagues and also Federico and your Ernst Young colleagues that have been replying them already. There's still a few left, so please have a look. And then I think we still have some useful links for you to share that you might want to consult. Someone made a comment, the links are not clickable when you're looking at this webinar, but you will be able to click them when we share the presentation with you. So please, Frederic, tell us.
Yes, thank you, Els. So indeed, about last slide, sorry, to give some useful links that could be useful for the standardization community. A webinar on drafting guidance for harmonized standards. So there's a dedicated link for the CEN webinar and another one for the CENELEC webinar. And this webinar is very interesting because it focuses on common issues encountered by technical bodies when drafting harmonized standards, and it focuses on drafting requirements. For example, clauses that are clear and unambiguous with unambiguous requirements. And as well, it does a recap on normative references again, because as Paco was just saying, the normative references issues are still one of the main issue leading to a lack of compliance. And then as well, you can find a link to the webinar on the restart of the new HAS system. But by following the webinar today, normally you have all the elements that you would need to start working under the new HAS contract. Thank you.
Yeah. I would. Okay, maybe I would like to go to the next slide, because on that slide, I would like to invite all the participants before leaving us today to take a moment to fill in our poll.